Alrighty, welcome to podcast number 7, The Age of Jackson. We'll be covering the years 1820 to 1845, focusing pretty much on, President Jackson. Okay, so let's go ahead and get started. Jackson's very well known president. He's one of the few presidents that gets his own era, the era of Jackson. He's very well known for this concept of Jacksonian democracy. All right, when we say Jacksonian democracy, what we mean is a democracy that is more inclined to allow the common man to get involved. So let the common man get kind of a piece of the pie. Andrew Jackson's really our first president who's from humble origins. He's very much always kind of seen as a common man, even though he does become one of the wealthiest Americans at the time. Okay, but let's real quickly kind of look at some of the principles of Jacksonian democracy. What we see happening in our Jacksonian democracy, we see universal suffrage for all white men. So no voting, no property restrictions whatsoever. We see a spoils system get put into place that basically, when a new party comes into power, they replace all the government jobs with basically new people that were supporters. We see this idea of letting the people have more of a choice of who runs for office, giving them more power at nominating conventions. And we also see the beginnings of what is known as popular campaigning, meaning that politicians basically target their campaigns at how can they help basically middle-class America or that common man, so to speak. Okay, Jackson has a very interesting path to the White House. In the election of 1824, Jackson's part of an election that has 4 candidates, Adams, Jackson, Crawford, and Clay. And if you look at the results there, and just take a sec to kind of get your bearings here, it's a weird election. Okay, Jackson gets most of the electoral votes. He gets 38%. He also gets most of the popular vote, 43%, but he doesn't win. Okay, because he did not get the majority of the Electoral College. By the Constitution, the vote goes to the House of Representatives. Now, this is known as the corrupt bargain because John Quincy Adams makes a deal with Henry Clay, who's a member of Congress. And basically, this corrupt bargain refers to this deal where Clay will have his supporters go with Adams if Clay becomes Secretary of State. He does that, and he wins. And so John Quincy Adams, the man who got 31% of the popular vote, beats the man who got 43% of the popular vote. And that is known as the corrupt bargain, which obviously is going to make lots and lots of people very angry. So fast forward 4 years to the election of 1828, and Andrew Jackson gets his chance for some payback. Okay, this time there's none of these fringe candidates. It's kind of a two-person race here. Jackson versus the incumbent Adams. Okay, it's an incredibly dirty election. There's not much of the issues being talked about. There's basically attacks on each person's character or whatever scandals that people perceive to be true. There's attacks on Jackson's mother as being a prostitute or a whore. Also, that his father was mulatto. Also, they bring up which is true, the fact that Jackson had killed people in duels and also had executed people when he was a general throughout his military career. There's also attacks on Adams that he's a snob, he's cold-hearted. There's even a story where it basically claims that Adams had used government money to buy prostitutes when he was in Russia, not for himself, but to, grease the wheels of local officials over there. So there's very little issues being discussed here. It's basically a mudslinging contest, which is kind of interesting. When Jackson becomes president, once again, he does institute the spoils system, which, as you can see there, introduces the practice of removing all office holders and replacing them with loyal supporters. And this is where the term "to the victor belong the spoils." Jackson argues that new blood coming into the government on a constant basis is a good thing. But what we see happening is that there's something to be said of having people who it's their career to do a certain job. They get good at it, blah, blah, blah. And when you just give people jobs based on how much they support you, not their competence or what have you, it leads to corruption and graft, which is what we see happening. Millions of dollars are stolen from the government during Jackson's presidency and his successor's presidency, so I don't think it works too well, and eventually it has to be dealt with. One thing it does do that I think is interesting that I think has kind of stayed with us since Jackson is this loyalty to party. Party loyalty, for many Americans, is incredibly important. No matter what their parties may or may not do, they are loyal to their party. Whether it's they're staunch Republicans or staunch Democrats, there are people where they stay with that party through thick and thin. And I think that's something that kind of starts with Jackson. He very much promotes this idea that you need to be loyal to your party kind of thing. Anyways, moving on. One of the big issues of Jackson's presidency is this idea of tariffs and sectionalism. Tariffs were considered to the North to be a necessity because, as I've kind of already mentioned in previous podcasts, the first American Industrial Revolution definitely starts in the early 19th century. With Jefferson's Embargo Act, to the War of 1812, to the Henry Clay's American System. There definitely is this effort to grow this American industry. Okay, like I previously mentioned, when we were colonies, the British really didn't encourage any kind of economic development, so we were basically just kind of a raw materials kind of economy, and now we're trying to shift away from that. And so the North very much wants these high tariff rates to protect their infant industries, whereas the South, they rely on free market trade. They rely on selling their tobacco, selling their cotton, selling their indigo and their other cash crops, to Europe. And so when these tariffs get slapped on these European nations, the European nations slap tariffs on us, making it harder for the Southerners to go ahead and make money. So what we see happening here is we see a United States of America that isn't very united. We see this concept of sectionalism where each section of the country kind of has their own interest, and they run counter to other sections of the country. And so it's really kind of weird situation here. John Calhoun, who was the vice president for us during this time, is quoted as saying, "I never use the word nation in speaking of the United States. I always use the word union or confederacy. We're not a nation, but a union, a confederacy of equal and sovereign states." So clearly there's a long way to go before Americans see themselves as kind of Americans, right? Anyways, the Tariff of Abominations, also known as the Tariff of 28, really gets the Southerners riled up. It increases the tariff from 23% to 37%. And the Southerners are just, hopping mad over this. John Calhoun writes his South Carolina exposition, which denounces the tariff. And he also, once again, kind of brings this idea of nullification kind of out. This nullification was brought up by Jefferson and stuff during the Alien and Sedition Acts crisis with the Kentucky and Virginia resolutions. But basically, Calhoun's saying, you know what? We have the right to strike this unjust law down and declare it null and void within our borders. So this idea of nullification is basically the state saying they have the rights to strike down federal law, which constitutionally is not acceptable. So Jackson basically is not going to tolerate this. He's definitely more of a pro-Southerner kind of guy. He might not like tariffs, but Jackson is not going to stand for this defiance to the federal government. This is legislation that was passed. It was signed into law, and states need to respect that. And so Jackson is incredibly angry with these Nullies in South Carolina that are threatening nullification. They're threatening secession. I mean, they're just going off the deep end here. Henry Clay, who will become known as the Great Compromiser, steps in and says, look, we can work this out, we can compromise, and the Tariff of 1833 is kind of the compromise. It basically says that we are going to reduce tariffs slowly over the next 10 years to the levels of 1816, which are levels that the Southerners can find somewhat acceptable. Now, South Carolina is more than happy to accept this because they feel like they were a little bit too aggressive. They're kind of stuck between the rock and the hard place. They don't really have a way out. And so when this is offered by Clay, they very much jump at it. Okay. Now, while all this is going on, Congress also passes the Force Bill, which gives Jackson the right to send in the military to collect tariffs. But by the time this Force Bill is passed, the crisis is kind of over with. But in one last kind of snub to the federal government, South Carolina nullifies the law. So, kind of funny. Anyways, Jackson is also very well known for the tragedy of the Indian removal during his presidency. The Removal Act of 1830 basically removes all Native American tribes to west of the Mississippi River to make room for white settlers, including Jackson, who has a plantation in Mississippi, I believe. Okay, even tribes that had tried to assimilate into American culture, known as the 5 civilized tribes, which would include the Cherokee, Choctaw, Creek, Chickasaw, and Seminole. Those are fun to say, by the way. Even these guys who say, "Look, we're going to adopt, the American way of government. We're gonna learn how to read and write. We're gonna become farmers and stuff like that." So they're going to kind of do all the things that they thought the American government wanted them to do, but it doesn't do them any good. Jackson basically wants these guys gone. And the Cherokee even go to the Supreme Court in the Cherokee Nation versus Georgia, and it still doesn't matter. The Supreme Court basically ruled in the favor of the Cherokee, but basically Andrew Jackson said John Marshall has made his decision, now let him enforce it. So he basically just kind of snubs him on that. So anyways, so the Native Americans are forced to leave. They're basically sent to Oklahoma Territory. This is where we have the very infamous Trail of Tears, where basically many of these Native Americans are basically forced marched out of their homelands into Oklahoma Territory, which is supposed to be Indian territory forever, and forever doesn't last very long, which we'll find out later. But yeah, it's obviously a very sad chapter in American history here. Here's a map that shows you the Trail of Tears, shows you where the 5 civilized tribes were, the Seminoles here, and the Creek, and the Cherokee, the Chickasaw, and the Choctaw, and kind of where they all went. So anyways, moving on. Last thing for today, the Bank War is kind of the last thing I want to mention here about Andrew Jackson here. Is Andrew Jackson was very much against, very much like Jefferson, was very much against this idea of having a national bank. He didn't feel like it was constitutional, even though it was already ruled as being constitutional. Jackson felt that it wasn't. So he essentially wants to get rid of it because he thinks it favors the elite. He doesn't think that the American, the common man, has much control over it. So he just wants it gone. And so basically, he's not going to renew it, and he basically forces it to die by just taking all the money out of the Bank of the U.S. He takes all the federal deposits out and then distributes that, to state banks. And that basically is going to shut down the Bank of the United States. Anyways, this leads to more economic uncertainty throughout the 1830s and 1840s. So I would say it's definitely a mistake on Andrew Jackson's part. But the Bank War is definitely an important part of Andrew Jackson's presidency. Okay. So anyways, hopefully this helped. Let me know if you have any questions. I forgot to put my contact page there, but follow me at Mr. Kevin Hyde or on YouTube, APUSH with Hyde. So thanks, guys. Hopefully this helps.